Good evening, everyone. Why don't we get started? A few guys will probably trickle in, but it's great to see everyone. This afternoon, our topic is going to be racial reconciliation. It's been something that many of the NCS chapters have talked about, have discussed, have done some programming, put things into action, some really, really great things. I just heard about a program this afternoon that the Winston-Salem group did. And it just sounded great. We executed some things in Connecticut this fall. We kicked off our fall season with Reverend Thompson, whom you heard last night, share his messaging, and it's been amazing since that event. But I thought today I would first introduce the other members of this panel. Everyone knows Jay Helvey from Winston-Salem, of course. And to Jay's left is Doug Goulding, my favorite tennis player, and Bill McLean, also from Winston-Salem. And I'm Wiley Mullins. I'm from the Fairfield, Connecticut chapter of NCS. But before we get started, I thought I would just share a very quick story with you. An event that occurred to me when I graduated college back in the day. My first job out of college was in New Orleans, Louisiana. I was a salesman for the Thomas J. Lipton Company, Lipton Tea. And my territory was in New Orleans all the way down to Slidell. My boss told me that I needed to be in Slidell, Louisiana every third Monday morning at 8 o'clock. So therefore, on Sunday nights after church, I would have to drive down to Slidell so I could be there to meet my customer. My customer's name was Win Ragland. Mr. Ragland owned a business, a family business in Slidell. And when I first met Mr. Ragland, he was about 6'4". He wore cowboy boots, blue jeans, a bolo around his neck. And the most distinctive feature about him was he had a KKK belt buckle on his belt. And it was interesting because we talked, I introduced myself, he asked me where I was from, I shared that, and we had a good discussion. And it was interesting because that never came up. That never was anything that I talked about, and nothing he ever mentioned. And I would see him for 6 consecutive months like that. And on the 7th month, my boss told me that Mr. Ragland wanted me to come to his house because he was ill. He would be working from home. And I followed the instructions, went every third Monday to Slidell, and this time had an opportunity to go to his house. And he lived really in the boonies. The road would be paved for a certain distance, and then it turned to a dirt road. And it was only one house on the road, and that was his house, set on a hill. And when I first drove up, it had this huge Confederate flag on the front porch. So we had the KKK belt buckle and the Confederate flag and a cannon out front. And I rung the bell. His maid came to the door, which was a short black woman, about 4'3". I told her I was here to see Mr. Ragland. She never said a word to me. She closed the door, and then 3 minutes later, she beckoned me to follow her through the house. And I did. And I saw all of these pictures. He was a collector of Civil War memorabilia. And as I walked through the house to the sun porch, I could see this. And I thought to myself, if I were to die out here, my parents would never find me. Never find me. Anyway, he was waiting for me. Again, this time he had a T-shirt on, his blue jeans, house shoes, and still the belt buckle. We never said anything. We would talk about Louisiana State football and Alabama football and that type of thing. And he always served me a glass of what he called the house wine, which was sweet tea and a piece of pecan pie from the trees out back. And we did that for 4 months in a row. And then I got a message from Mr. Ragland's assistant that he had passed away and that his wife expected me and requested that I be at the funeral. Well, I decided to go, and I went, and again, a little country church with the cemetery to the right of the church, and all the red pickup trucks with guns in the window, Confederate flag tags on front, and little Wiley Mullins. And anyway, that was it. And then shortly after that, I left to come to North Carolina to go to graduate school. And I thought that would be all I would have heard when Raglan, but that's just really where the story began. Back in those days, we didn't have cell phones and iPads and personal computers. We would have to wait until the newspapers came in the middle of the week from Atlanta, Memphis, Nashville, so that we could read about the Sunday newspapers would come on like Wednesday, Thursday in the library. So one day I was reading about Alabama football, and a thing caught my attention on the front page of the newspaper. And on the front page, it talked about a young woman in Atlanta. It was the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. It talked about a young woman in Atlanta that was to be the maid of honor in her college roommate's wedding. They had attended Agnes Scott in Atlanta, and she was killed hours before the wedding. And the thing that caught my attention was Slidell, Louisiana, and the last name Raglan. It was Raglan's daughter, Margaret, that had been killed. Someone had broken into the room at the hotel and had killed her. To this date, I don't think they ever found who did it. Well, I thought that would be it. I was just shocked and surprised. I sort of kept up with it in the newspapers until it no longer was a story, and that was it. Well, after I graduated a year or so later, I joined Procter & Gamble, and I was in New Orleans doing a trade show and came down a couple of days earlier. And after we set up the show, I had a whole day to do nothing, basically. So I drove around to my old accounts, and for some reason, I found myself in Slidell. And I went by his business, and they all knew me. And I asked how Miss Raglan was doing, and they said it had been a difficult time, of course, for her. And they said, why don't you go see her? So I found myself going down the dirt road to the big house and ringing the bell, and doorbell, the maid answered, same routine. 3 minutes later, I'm walking through the house, and this time Miss Raglan is sitting on the sun porch. And we're enjoying our house wine and pecan pie, and talked for a few minutes. I gave my condolences, and before I left, she said, I need to tell you something. She said, Wynn had this business for 41 years. And in those 41 years, you were the only one he did business with that he invited to this house. She said, Wynn loved you. And you know, I thought about it on the way back to New Orleans. I loved him. We had a great relationship. Despite all the things that could have turned off lots of people, the Confederate flag, the KKK belt buckle, perhaps my black skin coming inside his house, could have been a deterrent for a lot of people. But we overcame this idea that we call culture to get to know each other. And as I think about this panel this afternoon, racial reconciliation, sometimes we might need to look beyond ourselves and beyond our differences and find those things that we have in common and get to know each other that way. So with that, I'm going to ask my good friend Jay Helvey to kick off this panel. And my first question to Jay.
I'm saving you guys, man. I move what you just said. All in favor?
My first question to Jay is, Jay, we all come from different backgrounds. We come from different family traditions. We come from different church traditions. We come from different educational backgrounds. What are some things that you think or that you've had experience with that can bring us together as people?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, and your story has already answered that question. It really is, it's relationships, because you've got to get past everything. And so for me, that journey was, I was blessed. I grew up in a Christian home. My dad was a Baptist pastor, mom a teacher. And my first real exposure to racism, because we didn't have it in our house, I was blessed by that. I woke up one Sunday morning, and in the yard out front, there was a burnt area, and I said, what was that? And my parents I didn't really understand. I was probably, I guess it must have been 6 or 7. They said, well, Dad has invited a missionary from Africa to speak at the church, and some people were upset. And I don't even remember if they, said it was the KKK, but that's who it was. So I came, through childhood not really being, raised with any sort of overt racism that I can recall. And so my interest in this and heart for this, as some of you may know, was when Jane and I adopted twins from Ethiopia now a good 11 years ago. They were 4-year-old twins, boy and a girl. We had 3 biological sons, and that's its own story. But there the journey begins, and here's what I discovered through that. There's just so much you don't know. So for us, it manifested itself with treatment of the skin. They're getting ashy. Well, I didn't get ashy growing up. So I'm just like, Jane's doing all the research. You got to get, you got to put the oil on, and you got to. So here we are, making sure our kids aren't ashy. And then the hair. I mean, particularly the women's hair. And some of the brothers at Lodge were helping counsel me on this. And so, do you get it braided? I like braided because you didn't have to do that too often, and it took all day when they did it. And then one day, my daughter, I think because my wife's hair is straight, she wanted to get her hair straightened. And Jane says, well, Zinni wants to get her hair straightened. And it's like, it's $75. And she's like, so she comes home with a straight hair, and it's the summer, and maybe she's 7, 8. And next thing she knows, her brother's in the pool. She jumps in the pool, and there goes $75. Because as my brothers will tell you, a little water and African-American hair, and boom, you are all curls. I said, Jane, no more straightening. So I said, if we want to straighten her hair, you have to learn it. So Sunday nights, there's Jane with the curling iron, and there's Zinni, and we're watching TV. And so it just opened the door of, wow, I just never, thought about that. And then the next big breakthrough from an NCS perspective, we talked about doing some things, with the guys, and for whatever reason, Stu Epperson decides it's time. Now, Stu and his family have been very active in Rolling Hills with Ron Pegram and his wife, and he just says, we've got to have a lunch at Precise Seafood, and we need to get an NCS chapter started in East Winston. And we talked about that, but we never got any traction. Just God's time. It just wasn't happening. But we all showed up, about 12 or 14 of us. And next thing we know, we're flipping it over to Bill. Nobody, Kaleem sent out the email, but nobody, we knew it came from Stu, but nobody really had an agenda, and Bill talked and sort of, if we're going to meet, we got to have action. We got to do things. And it's like, well, the whole motto is kind of just showing up at a relationship. And I remember coming away from that lunch saying, all right, if this were a stock, I could sell it, and this is going to zero in about 2 to 3 weeks. But we showed up, and we kept showing up. And then we came up with this idea of Break Bread Winston-Salem, and then we started having dinner, because one of the things we realized, we're not at the same church. Social clubs were not there. We just don't, our lanes just, you don't live together. And so we started spending time with each other, and I'll come back to it. But the stories, just like your story, I can tell you stories that Bill shared that would just, your hearts just come together. And we just coming together and sharing stories. So that's a little bit of my journey.
Doug.
Yes, sir.
Doug, this past week was the 7th anniversary of Trayvon Martin's murder or death in Florida, in the state. And as you know, that generated a conversation in America that blacks tended to be on one side of the conversation, and their white brethren tended to be on the other side of the conversation. We all know what pain feels like when we lose someone that we love. I'd like for you to talk about empathy. How do we really, as Christian men, even though it may not be an experience that we have personally experienced, how can we share our empathy with someone else who may be going through something because of their culture?
That's a great question, Wiley. When I look at my own journey as a person of color uh, in this country, it has been one that's been more bitter than sweet. But one of the turning points in my life was I was in therapy. I was seeing a therapist because I had been going through one of the darkest, toughest time in my life. I was going through not only a divorce, but I was going through the loss of my job as the director of tennis for the United States Tennis Association for New Jersey, and that was because of my boss thought that as a man of color, I was too ambitious. I was actually interviewing for a position at the national level. And so when I had the interviews, the person that had interviewed me sent for the evaluation from the regional office from my boss because they wanted to hire me for that position, and she sent a report that was negative. So when I found out about it, I spoke to her. I said, "Why did you do that? I'm one of the best people on your team. Why would you do that?" And she said, "Your problem is you're too ambitious." That was painful. That was a loss because a lot of my identity was in my work, and I worked hard. So fast forward, I started seeing a therapist, and the therapist, after he did use his DSM-4 to diagnose for insurance purposes, he said to me, he held up, he asked me the question, he said, "Are you a Christian?" And I said, "Yes, I am." He said, "Okay, we have used this book, the DSM-4, to get a diagnosis for insurance purposes. But moving forward, as a Christian, we'll use this book, the Bible." When it comes to what takes place in the area of, in this country, when it deals with color and racism, I can empathize with the loss, because loss is loss. The loss of a wife through a divorce, or loss of a job because of the color of your skin. You realize that you're different, and it's hard to know that you can work as hard as you can and someone else is going to determine your fate. That's a hard pill to swallow. However, one of the things that has kept me from going insane is this therapist, Dr. Jones, and never forget the man, helped to change my perspective on how I look at this whole thing and how I survive this this maze of race. Because he said to me, "This is your operating manual." And this book talks about forgiveness. It talks about empathy, talks about mourning with those who mourn, rejoicing with those who rejoice. So as I started using this book, seriously using this book as my operating manual, I found out, one, that my identity was in the wrong place, and that my identity is not as a tennis professional and not as a black man, but my identity is I'm a child of God. And that was a game changer for me, because if you say you're a Christian, in my mind, I'm saying he's a child of God and he sees himself as such, so that means he's my brother. So we have the same father. So in my situation now, thank God, glory be to God, that I've transcended the issue of race. I see the color and the issues of the world and how the world deals with color. I see in the church and how we deal with the issue of color. I don't think it's biblical.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think enough of us are using this as their operating manual.
Mm-hmm.
So when you hurt, I hurt. Because I don't only have empathy to the person of color.
Mm-hmm.
I have empathy to my family because we're all a part of the family of God.
Mm-hmm.
I like what Winston-Salem is doing. So I've been down there some, and I'll be down there a lot more because my wife and I, we just moved into the inner city of Patterson, and we started a NCS group there because I've always been a part of Bergen County. But when I moved back to New Jersey, I felt the Lord impressing on my heart that if what you have with the NCS guy is good, you need to bring it over to the people of color, the men of color, because friendship and relationship, if it works for you, it'll work for them.
Great.
So we have made the sacrifice to go over, move into the community, live amongst them, and start an NCS chapter. So when you live with the people, you can more feel their pain, and you can empathize with them, and you can talk to them about the power of forgiveness.
Great. Thanks, Doug. That's awesome. Bill, you live in the state of North Carolina. Dr. King once said that the most segregated hour of the week is at 11 o'clock on Sunday mornings. And we're all members, most of us are members of church and attend church regularly. How can we help our congregations, local congregations, deal with this separateness?
Excellent question. First of all, I'd like to identify a couple of things. One, my personal experience. I grew up during the civil rights movement. I'm 72, and I marched and went to jail and went through all those changes, and I actually met Dr. King because I was head of the youth group of the Congress of Racial Equality in Winston-Salem, and that's after being involved with the Black Panther Party. And so in meeting with Dr. King, I realized that the issues that we were dealing with really weren't about race, because he made it very clear that there was only one race, and that was the human race. But the issues are related to sin and how we allow racism to perpetrate that. And so it was very difficult growing up for me to understand these things, because I was Sunday school, Baptist training union, never saw anybody white. Went to all black school. And so my adjustments in trying to eat at a restaurant that I'd never eaten in, really didn't have the money to eat in there, and to get locked up just for trying to get in was kind of strange to me. I'll never forget one of the worst whippings I ever got from my grandmother was at a place called Sears Roebuck's. And it had a white water fountain and a colored water fountain. And she would always take me to Sears Roebuck when she got her tax return and get me what they called a Sunday go-to-meeting suit that I wore all year long. And it would always be too big when I bought it so that it would fit me later on. But we were at Sears, and I kind of lagged behind her, and she ran around the corner, and I immediately drank out of the white water fountain. And everything would have been okay, except I had to get 2 drinks. Because the first drink, something's wrong. I must be in the wrong one. Because I had always thought that the white water fountain tastes like Kool-Aid or something. And this just was regular water. So I got another drink, and by that time, my grandmother was coming around the corner, and she lit into me. And man, it was horrible. She was all over me. And so I was really distraught putting on that Sunday go to meeting suit that day. But the worst part was when I got home, and she told Daddy that I had drank out the white water fountain. Now, I've already gotten it once. And here he goes taking off his belt. And I'm saying, what is it about this water? And he relaxed, and he realized I just didn't understand. And he sat down and said, we're trying to protect you so that you won't get hurt. Well, putting all that together and looking at the church stuff, I didn't know that white people could go to heaven. How could they go to heaven and treat us like this? That's not what they told me in Baptist training. That's not what they told me in Sunday school. They said that Christians are about love. So I couldn't understand that. And it took me a long time to really realize that we're all sinners. We all fall short. And that the church is no different.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Jay, you're on the board of Wake Forest University, one of America's great universities.
Says a Fuqua Duke University graduate. Thank you.
If you turn on the TV on any Saturday afternoon, particularly now as we enter the season of March Madness, you would think that the basketball teams came from the west side and the south side. Most of the players, whether it's Kansas, Wake, Duke, Ohio State, Michigan, are black. And they tend to be able to work well together. And they have done so for a while, haven't they? Yeah. How can we take that spirit that we see on the basketball courts and the football fields and bring it into our lives, be it church, our employment, anything that we are associated with, and work together with people who are different? What are some ideas you might have?
Yeah, well, that's another great question. I think you just have to put in the time. It's the relational time. It's kind of like learning to fly a plane. You have to have the hours, because otherwise you just, it's not going to work. You're going to crash. So for us in Winston, I'll point to two things. It was this, what I mentioned before, beginning NCS East chapter, going over to the African American neighborhood, having those guys be the leaders of the meeting, and then inviting guys to come. So that was one. Because now, it's really interesting. I had to work on my geography over there. It's like, so now I know my way around East Winston, but I had to, if I didn't have my phone, I thought, I know my way around Winston. I didn't know my way around Winston. That was one. Two, and just hearing the stories, the history of those neighborhoods. Because you have to understand, in Winston, a highway came through 52 and took out a lot of black businesses. And so we have our own history, our own story we had to work through. So I think just showing up was the first step, and that has just aged like a fine wine. It has just been beautiful. We so much. Bill shares a devotional. Guy Morgan is our host. Our speakers have been wonderful, and it's about a 50-50 mix. But I tell you what has also contributed, and that is this initiative we've started called Break Bread Winston-Salem. And it is to be intentional, black and white host, husband and wife, inviting other couples, a nice mix of people that are different, primarily black and white, and then doing it in a private home. Now it's small, but I'm going to guess all dinners to date, maybe it's 10 or 14. Bill and I have been in one of those groups, but when you share the stories, like your story, like a story that Doug just shared, Bill shared, now we share, it just starts to work on the heart. And if you do what Doug said, let this be your operating manual, you really, it's just like mix and stir. You break through those barriers. Now, I can't give you a solution for the church, but I can tell you, it's just spending time is a big thing. You just learn so much. You have the empathy because you know the story, and then you learn about the history.
Great, thank you. Doug, are you familiar with what was known at one time Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma?
Yes, I do.
Well, just so that the audience understands, I'll tell you a bit about Black Wall Street. It occurred in Tulsa, Oklahoma back in the early 1900s. It was a community of African American people where you had doctors, lawyers, dry cleaners, funeral home operators, restaurants. You had drugstore owners, pharmacists. And it was a model for the country for America's black community. In fact, Durham, North Carolina was starting a similar type of thing. Birmingham, Alabama, my hometown, was doing something similar. Then one night, the Klan came through and just burned Black Wall Street to the ground. And they were never able to rebuild. And there is still, to this day, people who feel like if we had just had this model, if we had just had this example, we would have something to build from. Doug, any thoughts on what we can do to not to be viewed as victims but victors? And what can the Christian community, how can the Christian community help not only African Americans, but Latinos and any other ethnic group, and poor whites who are trying to get a leg up? What can we do to help people?
I'm very much familiar with the Black Wall Street story. I studied black history a lot. I can remember being in high school in New Jersey, and the governor came to talk about the Holocaust because they wanted to put that as a part of the history in our school. And we had a meeting with the governor, and I asked the question, why do you think we need to study about the Holocaust? And the governor said, it was Governor Kane at the time, and he said, if you know the history, there's a good chance that you won't repeat it. And I said to him, so why do they prevent me from taking African American history in this school? I have to complete a certain amount of history before I can take African American history. I said to him, but for the black people, if other people know the history, they also won't repeat it. Doesn't that apply also for people of color? Because for the Jewish community, they wanted that in the school, the Holocaust, to be a part of the history program. What can we do? We need to know the history and be sensitive to the history. What can we do to change? For me personally, what I've done to move my life forward after going through what I've gone through is to choose forgiveness. Mm-hmm. And I say to my Caucasian brothers, the way that reconciliation takes place, because I'm not a big fan of racial reconciliation, I'm a big fan of if you are aware and if I forgive, then there can be reconciliation. Reconciliation just doesn't happen like that. There has to be an awareness that, as I said to someone the other day, if I've been hurt, it's my responsibility to forgive. if you want to stop hurting me, it's your responsibility to be aware.
Right.
Because without the awareness, you will continue to hurt me. No matter how much I've been hurt, I have a responsibility to forgive. I tell my son, I have a son who's 20 years old, and I said to my son, son, you have an advantage. We were living in Alabama, Wiley State, and we chose to move back to the Northeast because, my son made the honor roll at a private school, which was a white school in Alabama, and the white kids in his class, he was the only black young man that made the honor roll. They told him that they made a mistake. The white kids. That he doesn't belong on the honor roll, they made a mistake. So I can see my son going through some of the similar things, and as a father, it pains my heart. But I try to flip the script, and I say to my son, son, adversity can be an opportunity. So as a father, as a man of color, and that's not my identity, as I said earlier. My identity is I'm a child of God. Because when I see myself as such, it helps me to deal with some of the things that comes at me, because as a child of God, my first responsibility is to forgive. But when I see my son going through certain things, I have to flip the script and say, son, the adversities that you go through can be your advantage. It's an opportunity. So for us, what we can do is learn to be aware, and for the folks on my side, learn the art of forgiveness. And that's what I do in Paterson, New Jersey, because there's a lot of young black male who are in jail and who are living a life of that's not moving them forward. And I believe the antidote for them moving forward is to forgive.
All right. Bill, you grew up in an era when options were limited. If you were a young black male and you wanted to pursue a college education, more than likely you would apply to an HBCU, a historical black college or university. There is one of the most renowned right in your city of Winston-Salem State. But there have been those in recent years that have struggled financially. In fact, Morris Brown University in Atlanta has closed down because of lack of support. A lot of black students that attend these schools now that could attend really other schools still go because they want to feel welcome. They want to not be the minority. They want to feel like they can contribute in a way equal to anyone else. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, because I was an athlete, I did go to predominantly white institutions. But had it not been for that, there's no way possible. But I own a business, and it's a production business where we do sound and light. And some of the colleges that I used to work at, like St. Paul's University in Virginia, doors are closed. I actually coached basketball at Shaw University in Raleigh, and every other year its doors are about to close. And one of my clients in Greensboro was Bennett College, and they just got off the national news because they're about to close.
And Bennett is an all-female college in Greensboro.
My daughter went to school there, that's why I'm familiar. And what is happening is that there's a tremendous inequity in distributions of wealth. And it is causing these smaller institutions of color to suffer because they can't get funding. Private schools depend upon donations and grants. And when there's less money in general, then the donations that go to them are smaller. And also, they served a tremendous purpose years ago because black kids wouldn't have had anywhere to go because they weren't allowed to go to majority schools. But now they can go anywhere that they qualify for if they can come up with the money. So some of those schools suffer because of that as well. So I think as we talk about this issue of racial reconciliation, that part of the consideration has to be financial. Mm-hmm. You know, I look at some of the guys in New Canaan that I've worked with, Stuart Epperson, Jay Helvey. They have helped us a lot. And it really hasn't cost them because they use their influence as much as they do their resources. And I think there's a lot of things that could be done to help minority communities, people, and institutions if our brothers would use their influence and not necessarily their dollars.
Yeah, that's right.
Because we have a tremendous need. And I assure you, it's like our school system in Winston-Salem. It horrifies me because we have some of the top schools in America in that city, and we have the worst. And guess what the difference is? And if those who are doing well would just use their influence, they could bring those lower schools up. And so I say, as we talk about reconciliation, the first thing, we got to not talk about race, but we got to get straight with God. Mm-hmm. Because if we get straight with God, some of these issues will evaporate.
Amen.
Mm-hmm. Because he won't tolerate it. Mm-hmm. God sees what's going on. Mm-hmm. And see, all resources belong to the resource.
Amen.
And he didn't give them to anybody for them just to have excess. He expects them to make sure that nobody around is suffering because of their excess. Right. And so the issue about the black schools is not just about the historically black institutions, but it's about the minority communities in general.
Right. Thank you. I think we've got about 10 minutes left, and I wanted to make sure that if there were members of our audience that had some questions, we'd like to take those right now. Yes, sir.
I ask this with some trepidation, but speak louder, please. I ask this with some trepidation, but what are the blind spots that you see in your white brothers that seem to occur over and over again? You'll need to repeat it.
Okay, his question was, what are the blind spots? He's talking to the African American panelists, and I assume myself. What are the blind spots that you see in our white brothers that occur over and over again? And I'll start that, Doug, and we'll just go down the road. I think Bill hit on it. You see, you know the congressmen, and they know you. You know the senators, and they know you. You know the governor, and they'll take your call. If you are from certain communities, you won't get past the receptionist. Now, one thing that happens in black churches during political season that just doesn't happen in white churches is that the doors open and all the politicians come through and come to church service and visit and say, we love you, we're working for you in Washington. So the schools that he's talking about, say in North Carolina or Alabama or New Jersey or wherever, just as an example, you know, tell your Congress people and your senators and your mayors and your governors and your public servants that you're watching them and that you want them to clean up those schools and make them on par with the schools in the suburbs. That's one thing you can do.
Again, going back to the operation manual, it says, love thy neighbor as thyself. And as a Christian, so I don't, it's not that you're a white man, you're a Christian, you're a child of God. So this becomes our operation manual. So the Bible says, the least of these, if you see someone suffering, you need to come alongside them. And you can't separate your social life from your Christian life. We can't do that. And we can't, for me, when I look at Patterson, for example, I can't see the folks suffering in Patterson, and I have the information and the help that they require, and as a Christian, don't do it. God is going to require that of me. So from my Caucasian brothers, you have to see us as your brothers, and come alongside. Because we're all going to get in together. We're not going to get in, and we're not going to live on another side in heaven. This is a practice run for what we're going to do up there. We're practicing down here for what we're going to do up there. Mm-hmm. Okay, we're going to spend a lot more time up there than we did down here.
All right, Bill.
I think that probably the blind spots are part of what Jay is trying to do in Winston-Salem. And that's simply by bringing us together. I'm telling you, how can you know my pain if you're never there when I'm hurting? I once told my buddy Stuart Epperson, and Stuart Epperson is a trip to me. Oh, yeah. I coached his son in basketball. That's how I got to meet him. And the first day I visited the house, I walked down the hall, and here's Reagan and Nixon and Johnson, everybody. And these pictures are taken at his house. That means they've been there. And I'm like intimidated. And then he's asking me about what's going on in the community, And I said, you need to come over there and see. How can I tell him my pain? And guess what? He came, freaked me out. My wife says, did you see that big black Mercedes over there? And I said, it was Stu. And he's out there picking up these kids and everything. And my wife is trying to get him a vegetation sandwich or something, And she says, he's serious. Because we haven't seen this. He came in the community to witness for himself, and he has not left.
That's great. That's great. Well,
I think as a white man, I live in the North, and unfortunately, people in the North think that there isn't as much racism in the North. We just know how to hide it a lot better.
Yeah,
I think Dr. King said that racism he met in Chicago was worse than any racism he met anywhere in the South.
Well, my granddaddy said it's all South past Canada.
That's kind of a lead-in. I think one of the things that I've learned being involved on the west side of community, west side of Chicago where I live, is that as a white man, growing up in the white suburbs, I have a level of privilege that I don't even know about.
Yeah,
Okay?
amen.
That's that awareness you're talking about.
Yeah.
I completely agree. As white people, we need to be aware of there's so much subtle difference in the amount of privilege that we just assume we have.
That's right.
And just in a 15-second illustration, I ran a yellow light, cop thought it was a red light, pulled up next to me, past the intersection, said roll down the window, but he was looking at who was inside the car. It was a Chicago cop. I was a white guy, so he said, you know what, that was red, I could write you a ticket, but you can go. I have no doubt that if I had been a person of color, I would have been pulled over and I would have gotten a ticket. You know, it's just, there's so much subtle stuff still going on, and everything you're saying is spot on. If we don't build relationships, if we don't build awareness, we just keep that wall
Let's just keep going
right
a
where
little
it
bit.
is.
Okay, sure. Okay.
Two more back there.
Stu,
Talk a little about Section 8 housing. There's one near you, and maybe tell how you can get to know Section 8 housing.
Well, the one thing about the law, years ago, I retired from a housing authority. I worked for HUD. And the law said that if a man was in the home, that the family would lose all its benefits.
Yeah.
Come on, y'all.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you know what that did to the black family?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
And then we wonder about fatherlessness.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, you know, slavery in America was a little bit different than slavery in other worlds, because slavery in America took the father out of the home. HUD took the father out of the home. And look at the results that we have. The black family is in turmoil because it struggles, because without these women, these wonderful, great, powerful, thank God for the black woman, our community would be dissolved. And so that public housing thing has really done a lot to destroy the black community.
sure. More questions? Okay.
Thanks. Want to go back to, I think, the point that you were making. I probably got 100 questions, but I'm trying to squeeze this one in. But going back to the point that you were making about us kind of like not being, our identity not being caught up in our race so much. I guess my question is to, it seems that feels really good, but it seems that there's an inconsistency, especially in the Christian evangelical community, when we talk about patriotism, right? So I think that it's not biblical for me to identify as a black man, but if it's very biblical, or I wouldn't say it's biblical because I don't agree with that, but it's okay for me to identify as a very proud American, right? So do you think that there's some inconsistency? Could you speak to that?
Yeah. Yeah. The question is the inconsistency with the not being identified as a black man, you know, and the inconsistency with that. You know, all I can tell you, my friend, is that it's an identity issue. If I identify myself as a black man, I will not embrace forgiveness. Because so much, as the brother just talked about the privilege, I've encountered so much as a person of color. What makes me survive, what makes me strive, what makes me live is forgiveness. My identity is, first, I'm a child of God. I have to keep that. That's what keeps me day by day. That's what keeps me. If I don't see myself first and foremost as a child of God, my identity is not a black man. I'm a child of God who happens to be a black man. I have to keep that first because I'll go crazy if I don't. Because for years, I harbored anger and hate because of the hurt and the injustice that I encountered. What has set me free is seeing myself first and foremost as a child of God. Yeah, but no. I don't see myself I don't identify myself first and foremost as an American. That's not my identity. my identity is I'm a child of God. And in our chapter in New Jersey, in Patterson, and I have my brother, my friend, Bill here, sitting in the audience, when we open our meetings in the morning, we remind ourselves who we are, because we have black guys and white guys, homeless guys in our meeting, and everybody around the table. We tell ourselves we are a child of God. It changes the game.
Okay.
I wanted to comment about this patriotism thing. And I think that all of us have to recognize that we have a common enemy, and it is politics. Oh, that is sin. Oh, no, I'm not joking. Anything that can divide people like politics does has got to be sin.
Yeah.
First of all, blacks fought in every war that's ever been fought. There was even blacks fighting for the South in the Civil War. So this issue of patriotism should never come up in a conversation about a black man. My grandparents fought in World War II. My wife fought in, what they fight over there in Saudi Arabia, but Desert Storm. I mean, so don't talk about patriotism. Because if I was born in this country, and I worked in this country, and I fought for this country, I'm a patriot. Yep. Now, because I don't agree with you, or because you a donkey and I'm an elephant, or vice versa, doesn't mean I'm not patriotic.
Yes, sir.
I've worked a lot in East Winston with the black community there. Having them work for me and that type of thing, and I'm still involved a lot. And what I see, not only there, but, being 6 years old, we've got to understand that Satan wants to divide. The evil one wants to divide, and he does a good job at it. And we've all believed lies
Yes,
in our lives.
yes, yes. Yeah.
All of us. We've all believed lies. And it's to come into grips with those lies, because I got to deal with it every day. Coming to grips with those lies and making sure that the truth has entered in. And it goes a long way with reconciliation
Yep.
and life together.
Yep. Yep. Well, yes, sir.
Well, I thank God for this right here. I thank God. Yeah, every one of y'all, my brothers, you believe in Christ Jesus, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. You, my brothers, ain't gonna look at nothing different. Though I do believe a house that divide can't stand. We talking about that politic thing. It will not never stand. One want this power, one want this power. Making God a Democrat, excuse me, y'all. Making them, this part over here a Democrat, this over here a politician. Which one is which? Because both of them are done wrong. And they always talking about change. Until you change your heart with Jesus Christ, ain't nothing gonna change.
That's right.
I might have got thrown off a little bit, but I thank God for that.
Yeah.
That's all right.
All right. Well, I'm sorry, a few more questions?
Yeah, I have one.
Please, stand up.
Sure. So, you guys kind of touched on this earlier. In the past, HBCUs were very important because there weren't opportunities for black students to go to other universities. What do you guys see as the future for HBCUs going forward? And is there ever not, going forward, is there ever a point where that purpose becomes less necessary? Say if there becomes a time when, in a utopian society where everything is egalitarian, is there a point where the need for those universities doesn't exist, or what do you guys think the future is for that?
Well, I think that HBCUs will always be needed. And the reason why I say that is because there is a level of understanding that they will not get other places. And also, one of my friends who is a college professor at an HBCU told me recently that she looks at every child that comes into her class as some mother's child. and not as just a number and a grade. And people can understand, when you understand where someone's been, as someone said earlier, you can understand what their struggle has been like. And if you take away those opportunities that North Carolina Central University in Durham, or Shaw University in Raleigh, if you take away those opportunities from kids, where else are they going to go and feel a part and be productive? Seriously. Well, you guys have been an amazing group this afternoon. I think the conversation should continue.
Amen.
That's right.
Thank you, Wiley. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.